We are going to use our pumpkin patch program in order to demonstrate some input validation. So currently, when we run this, we can enter the number of varieties and total up how many pumpkins we have for each variety in the pumpkin patch. If I run it again and enter number of varieties and then make a mistake and enter a letter, I get a mismatch exception error and I have an issue. So we are going to work on resolving that issue. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go back to the code here, and we are going to take a look at where we would have to put that validation. So that validation is going to have to occur when we are inputting values. And so this line of code in.nextInt should not execute if we don't have proper data. So we use an if statement, and we use one of our scanner class methods, and it's in.hasNextInt to test to see, is our next piece of data an integer? If it is, then we are going to go ahead and with our calculations. If it is not, we are going to provide feedback to the user in a user-friendly format and tell them as specifically as possible what went wrong. And we would say input error on varieties. If we go ahead and execute our code again and input something wrong for the number of varieties, we now get an input error. But we also get this message that the total pumpkin patch count is 0. And so this line of code should probably execute if we get that error. So that means we should bring all of our calculations, input, output, all parts of our code, and put it into this if statement so that all of that gets executed within the if we have valid data. And then I shouldn't any longer get that error message, or I'll get an error message, but I won't get total number of pumpkins in the pumpkin patch. I can do a Control-Shift format to reformat my code here so it has the right indentations. I have another issue now, however, though, because if I do input the correct number in the pumpkin patch and I put a number in or a letters in for varieties, I still have another exception error, which means we need more input validation. This time, the input validation is going to occur inside of our loop. So we are going to repeat this process for inputting validation there. We entered the statement to verify if an integer was inputted immediately after our prompt. So remember, it's prompt, check to see if it's a valid integer. If it is a valid integer, then we read in the data. So if we have nextInt, then we are going to go ahead and input our next integer. But if it's not, we are going to produce an error message, and that error message should again be user-friendly, and it should try to tell the user as specifically as possible what is wrong. So in this case, we have an invalid value for that variety. And so now we have a message that's going to tell us that something is wrong. And if I do Control-Shift format, fix the formatting, kind of double check for errors, let's see if we can get the error message to be produced. We also have this output statement. We had decided that we needed to put it inside with all of our calculations. So this is going to be a little bit tricky. I need to put that statement in the appropriate place so that it doesn't print. Let's leave it right there. We're going to see what happens. Okay. So if we run this, how many varieties do we have? 3, and we enter some pumpkins, but we make a mistake and it says invalid. And then I have kind of like the accumulated total so far, but I don't know that I should have that output if the error is occurring. And I think it would be better if I could possibly like fix this all together. So there is a little trick that we can do. We giving them some feedback that says invalid value for that variety. Let's run it again and just kind of see what happens. If I do 3 varieties, I enter a few for the first variety, make a mistake on the second one, invalid entry. How many pumpkins for variety 3? Invalid entry. So there's some stuff going on here. So we're going to have to kind of deal with this. So it's actually going through the loop again and again, even though we said invalid entry. So we don't want that to happen. So a couple of things that's happening here. When I input an integer, everything is all good. And as soon as I input a string or a character, what happens is on the buffer, I get, and so at this point right here, and let me just kind of type some code out here, I hit H and I hit enter. So I actually have kind of two things that are being entered. And so it thinks H is not an integer and it goes back and I haven't like cleared my buffer is one way to think of it. And so it keeps saying, well, it's invalid. It's invalid. I want to clean that up. I want to clean that up so I can actually, if I input an invalid variety, the program will still run. So what I'm going to do is basically capture that H that is on my input stream. I called it the buffer. It's the input stream that it is on. So if I do in dot next line, just a blank in dot next line, that's going to read in the next item that is on my input stream. I also believe I need to do 2 of these because that's going to read in my carriage return. So this is going to basically read in the string, and I believe I need to have 2 of them, one to capture the return statement. If I try this, let's see what happens. We got 3 pumpkins, enter some letters, invalid, how many pumpkins for variety 2, so let me say 45, and then 30 for variety 3, and I have 75 pumpkins. But it never re-entered the amount for variety 1. So I'm going to trick my program into getting the appropriate number of values. And I shouldn't say trick. Basically, what I'm going to do is wind back the clock. So count was equal to 1 here. I checked to see if I had an integer. It failed. I produce an error message. I capture what's on the buffer, but this is still all wrapped inside of a for loop. So I'm going through the loop again and again. I basically want to reset my counter so I can go back if I made that mistake. So I can do that by changing my loop control variable. Typically, I wouldn't tell you to do this on a for loop. But in this particular case, if we want to fix that error, we have 3 pumpkins. I make a mistake. It now says how many pumpkins for variety 1, 45, variety 2, 60. Make a mistake. Invalid value. How many pumpkins for variety 3? I have 4. And then it gives me my total pumpkins. So this provides one way that you can add some input validation into your programs. It also provides a way, in this particular case, that I can basically kind of reset and input some additional data. Reading in or clearing the scanner by reading in the values that are left on the scanner is what these 2 lines of code do. Let's just see what happens if I comment this one out. Not 100% sure that I need it, but let's do 3 varieties, 45 for the first variety, error message or error on the next, and my program fails. So I have to have 2 in dot next lines. One's to read the string, and one in my mind is to like read I call it the return. It's the enter key, okay, off of the buffer. And last but not least, let's just make sure that when I run the program and I make a mistake to start with, I just have an input error on varieties. I could make that more robust, but I'm not going to. But I was checking to see if I needed to move this line of code around anywhere else. And so I'm just going to do a format, Control Shift F, and that should do it. That gives you some examples of input validation using a loop.